Welcome to the church family that is lifting lives through living love, inspiring hope, filling with faith, and transforming our world. These recorded messages are made available so that you might have additional opportunities to stay connected with us and that you might learn and grow in your faith. God bless you as you hear the word today. And now, the message.
My name is Monica Masick, and our scripture reading today comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, where the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face, because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. May the Lord bless the reading and hearing of his word.
Well, thank you to Sue and Marilyn for sharing their stories of faith with us. I hope you enjoy hearing these stories, and I hope they cause you to reflect on your own story as well. Because there's something about stories. They have this amazing power when you think about them. They break down division between people. They connect us across generations, across cultures. I mean, stories have this ability to move us to tears or to cause us to break out in laughter. They lift and fill the human spirit. There's this correlation between a well-told story and a well-lived life, because all of us want to live lives that make for good stories. And this is our recognition in this series, is that our lives are composed of stories, that each one of us represents a story that God is telling in the world. But all these stories are connected. It's not just your story and my story, but it's our story, because all of us are connected to a great big story that God is telling about the healing and the redemption of the world through his son, Jesus Christ. That's the story of our faith. But all stories have an origin. In fact, the genre, origin stories, are so commonplace that you see them all over. As Tracy said in her children's moment, Marvel's cinematic universe has made a fortune telling origin stories that say where we are from and how did we get here. But as Tracy said, origin stories aren't just about how superheroes got their powers, but it's also about how they came to understand the responsibility, the purpose behind those powers. Well, in the same way, the Bible is full of origin stories as well. We call them call stories. Moments where God calls a particular woman or a particular man to play a larger purpose within his story, the story of salvation. And the way that we, today's story, there's lots of them throughout Scripture, but today's story, Moses and the burning bush, is this quintessential example of an origin of a call story. Now, before we kind of dive into the story, I want to take a step back and just mention these journals again, the story of our faith. What we did is we took lots of stories in the Bible, well-known ones that we all learned in Sunday school, and we tried to organize them around 6 words. Last week, Perry and Seth preached about grace and salvation. So that was one word, salvation. And then this week, call. And then we also picked 4 other words, providence, risk, faithfulness, and community. And we organized these journals, these stories, the stories of the Bible, around these 6 words, kind of as an homage to Ernest Hemingway, who is said to have originated a form of storytelling called 6-word stories. The story goes that he was in a bar, perhaps, or was out drinking with friends, and he took a dare. I kind of picture it like a Name That Tune, like I can tell a story in 10 words, I can do it in 8. And finally, he took the dare to tell a story in just 6 words. And the story he told was For Sale, Baby Shoes, Never Worn. And I've never really liked that story. Even though it's brief, even though it's poignant, I've never really liked it because I know the pain of miscarriage is a very real pain for many families in our world and in our church. But I like this expansion of the story that Tom Gold wrote. He kind of said, well, if For Sale, Baby Shoes, Never Worn, but don't worry, the baby is fine. We just bought too many shoes. It turns out that babies don't need to wear shoes that often. It's not as poignant as Hemingway's, but it's a lot more hopeful, right? But the point is you can do a lot in just 6 words. You can communicate a lot of truth. Think about how many 6-word sayings there are just in our culture, right? Yogi Berra, it ain't over till it's over. Shakespeare, which I know came centuries before Hemingway, but still, you can take the whole story of Hamlet and boil it down to 6 words, to be or not to be. Even Disney and Toy Story get on the act. You've got a friend in me. It's amazing. You can capture a lot of truth in just 6 words. You can do the same thing with stories in the Bible as well. Pastor Sean Mullins kind of took different stories of the Bible and some of his, just kind of crystallized around 6 words. Some of the ones I like that he did is creation. God said, let there be light. Crucifixion. God, why have you forsaken me? Or resurrection, the message of the angels. He's not here. He is risen. Or Paul does it to the church later on, the same message of resurrection. O death, where is thy sting? You can communicate a lot of truth in just 6 words. So the journal takes these different stories and it challenges you every day to boil the story down to 6 words as a creative exercise, as a way of distilling the truth of the story. And then after you do that for 5 days, the 6th day asks you, what's your story? And can you tell it in 6 words? And so after a week spent reading and thinking about grace and salvation, this morning I finally came to my 6 words, which was really more of a prayer for me, which was, help me live less than perfect. And I could only kind of say that after a week of boiling down and kind of saying, that's what grace is about. Help me live less than perfect, knowing that your grace is more perfect than I. Anyways, that's why we've been doing this. And I've had a lot of fun doing this 6-word story format. So I'm going to do it again with Moses' story. I'm going to do it in 3 different sections, 3 different movements, each with a 6-word sentence. The first one being, it was just an ordinary bush. Which isn't how we normally tell the story, right? Like, this is not an ordinary bush. Like, we normally picture it like, like a big billboard with spotlights, Like, Moses couldn't have helped but miss this bush. But actually, the way the story is told, the text, seems to indicate that the bush was much more subtle. Moses sees it, but he has to turn aside to investigate. He has to approach it and go closer to see what is going on. Now, this is an origin story for Moses, but it's not the beginning of his story. It's more of a turning point. The beginning we kind of know already, right? Tracy recapped it in her children's moment. Moses' beginning is that he is born a Hebrew slave in the land of Egypt. And to protect him from the Egyptians, his mother places him in a basket made of reeds and lets him loose, sets him into God's care along the Nile River. And he's found by an Egyptian princess of all people who adopts him and claims him as her own. And so Moses has this unique identity that he is brought up with one foot in both worlds. On the one hand, he is brought up with all the training and education that an Egyptian prince would receive. And yet his other foot is knowing that he hasn't belonged to this world, that he's always an outsider, that he's actually a member of the people who are being oppressed by those he lives among. And this discord in his spirit, this fracture, is so deep, and it finally ignites and expresses itself when one day he's moving along and he sees an Egyptian taskmaster abusing one of his kinsmen. And something inside him snaps and he reacts immediately and he kills that Egyptian taskmaster. And he thinks for a moment it's safe that no one saw, but the person who saw was the Hebrew slave that he helped. And when word begins to spread, he's filled with shame and fear, and he flees out into the desert. And he takes a job watching sheep. His whole life lived in the shadow of that failure, that fear that he feels. He probably thinks, this is the only thing I'm ever cut out for, the only thing I'm good at. This is what my life is going to be. I'm going to tend sheep the rest of my life. Until he sees the bush. As I said, it was just an ordinary bush. What made the bush, what made it extraordinary wasn't the bush, it was the fire. The fire which burned without consuming the bush. In that fire was the activity and presence of God. Author Ruth Haley Barton kind of reflecting on this and reflecting specifically on the fact that Moses turns aside to investigate. She asks the question, how many of us have burning bushes in our lives, but we don't see them because we're moving too fast and we pass them right by? She says many of us are choosing to live lives that do not set us up to pay attention, to notice the places where God is at work, and to ask ourselves what these things mean. We are blind to the bush that is burning in our own backyard and the wisdom that is contained within it. We squander the gift of this day as it is, these people as they are, the uniqueness and sweetness and even the bittersweetness of this particular place and journey as it is right now. The voice of God calling to us in our own wilderness. She asked the simple question, what's burning in you and around you? Are you aware of the activity and the presence of God? She quotes this famous poem by Elizabeth Barrett Browning that says, earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit around it and pluck blackberries. If you want to receive a call from God, the first step is to notice what's burning and to be willing to slow down and turn aside, take off your shoes, and listen for God to speak. Moses did that, and then comes the second movement of the story. God calls to him. God calls him by name, Moses. And to me, this is significant that he calls him by name, because he didn't just shout, hey you, shepherd guy, anyone, come here. He said, Moses, which by implication means that God's call is individual and particular and personal for every single one of us. It's not generic or general. God's call is tailor-made for you right where you are right now. Think about Moses. No one else could have fulfilled this call that God was laying on him. Moses is uniquely positioned between two worlds. He has all the education and training and leadership development of an Egyptian prince. He knows the Egyptian culture inside and out. He knows how to speak truth to Pharaoh. He knows how it works. And yet he's also been raised, nurtured and fed by a Hebrew mother, fed on the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. No one else could bring all that together and be the leader who God needed in that moment except Moses. It was tailor-made for who he was. I once heard a pastor talking about the topic of purpose, and he made the generic statement, which I'd heard plenty of times, that every single person has a purpose in life. That, I was like, check, I've heard that all before. But then he made a second statement that I had never really thought about. He says, when you think about all the problems in the world, every problem that exists in the world exists because someone failed to live out God's purpose for them. Think about that. Every problem we see, violence, homelessness, hunger, it exists because someone is failing to live out God's purpose. That's how God meets the needs of the world, is by calling each of us to a higher purpose in life. It's not just the celebrities and the athletes and the politicians and the people who have power and influence. It's us, you and me. It's by being good teachers and being good neighbors and good parents and good citizens and good friends. That's how God meets the needs of the world. Every single one of us has a unique purpose and calling in life. So how do we find that purpose? Author Dan Webster, he often uses the analogy of a piano. He says, if we were to lift up the piano that Travis played so wonderfully a moment ago, we'd see all the strings exposed. And if we were to shout down into those strings, hey, there'd be one string which continued to vibrate longer than the rest because that particular string would resonate with the tone and cadence frequency of our voice. And Dan says, this is how it is with God's call. When God shouts, hey, to you and me, there's some string that may vibrate in each of us that doesn't vibrate in anyone else. Just for us, it resonates. That's the fire that's burning. And so my question is, what is it that resonates and burns in your heart? Is it when you hear issues of homelessness or violence or drug addiction? Is it children and education? Is it healthy families and mental health? What is it that stirs something inside of you because you take those passions of your heart and you combine them with the platform that God gives you, where God has placed you, and the gifts that God has placed within you. And where all those things come together, your passions, your platforms, and your gifts, that's your unique calling that no one else has. And the thing is, we get so caught up in the game of comparison that I wish I had someone else's calling, right? Like I wish I had their gifts, or I wish I had their platform, that they can do things that I could never do, or I wish I even had their passion. Like I would much rather, be that excited about, I don't even know what I'm excited about, but the thing is we don't get to trade calls. You can't live out someone else's call any more than you can give your call to them. Each of us has to live out the particular purpose that God gives us, because that's his call on our lives. And then we get to the third movement. When God makes the call plain to Moses, Moses does not want to go. Very simply, he does not want to go. He says, whoa. I think you have the wrong guy here. You need to ask someone else. My brother is much more eloquent than I am. See how he does that whole comparison thing? Not me. You got the wrong guy. Hey, he's afraid. And the truth is, I think for all of us, when we experience a God call in our life, on some level, we respond with fear. And that fear is about inadequacy, insufficiency. Hold on, I'm not enough. I don't have enough time to fit this in, right? I don't have enough money. I'm not smart enough or big enough, or I'm just one person. What difference can I make? The fear we have is around insufficiency. But notice how God responds to Moses. He doesn't say, that's okay, Moses. You can do it. I believe in you. He doesn't say that. He doesn't point to Moses' sufficiency. Instead, God replies by saying, I will be with you. You can believe in me. You see, when God calls us, God doesn't send us out to do things on our own. Instead, when God calls us, God journeys with us into the world. And there's a huge difference between those things. God calls us out of places where we are self-sufficient. Like, we got it, God. We can take care of this. He calls us out of self-sufficiency into places of dependency, where we can depend on him, where we must live by faith and trust in his guidance, his grace, and his strength. For me, this kind of came true in my own life in January of 2010. 7 years earlier, my wife and I went and lived in Haiti. And you would think that was a big call, and it certainly was, but I wasn't really that afraid of going and living in Haiti. I don't know, I was young and stupid, I don't know. But Jamie and I lived there for 2 years, and then we continued to stay in touch with this mountain community called Fondois. And then in 2010, the earthquake hit Haiti. This is a picture of the guest house where Jamelyn and I lived. And Jamelyn was actually in Haiti with the mission team when the earthquake hit. Luckily, she was fine, her team was fine, but the community was not. All the buildings were instantly knocked down. Everything that we'd known and, where we'd lived, where we'd worked, and the place where I felt a particular call was the school. And it was kind of a Moses moment in my life where I felt uniquely positioned. Like, I had this history and knowledge of this small community that didn't have any resources, that needed to be rebuilt. And yet I was positioned in this big church, St. Luke's United Methodist Church at the time, where I had this opportunity in order to be a bridge between these two places. And the place where I felt a particular call was at the school, where my wife and I had worked and where I taught English when we lived there. And so, right after the earthquake, this is what the school looked like. You could see the students in the upper left meeting under tarps. That was their classroom. And so we quickly got people together and we went down and we built some temporary classrooms on the bottom right-hand corner. You can see that. But we knew those buildings were temporary. They weren't designed to last forever. They were just to meet the need come September. They could reopen the schools. So there's a permanent school, though. And Father Joseph, who's kind of the local leader of the Fondois community, he asked me, he says, Dave, will you be point person for all the donors who are wanting to help us with this project? And even though I knew the task was big, I said, yes, I'd love to do that. That's exactly what I want to do. I had no idea what I was getting myself into because the school was a multi-million-dollar project. It was the first sign of hope for this community. It wasn't just about serving the kids in the school or the kids that would attend the school. It was a sign of hope for the whole community. It was jobs. It was life coming back. And so I was kind of, my job, I just said I was the convener, but I was totally overwhelmed because that project was bigger than anything I had imagined, had managed before. But my job was just simply to bring people to the table and like I said, to be a bridge between the Haitian people and the leaders who I knew and had history with and with these donors that I didn't have much history with, but I could speak their language and I could explain and keep them at the table. But it was hard because we had it was not a smooth process. There were so many bumps along the road. And I remember one particular moment where Father Joseph felt the need to fire the engineer we'd been working with and hire a new engineer, which set us back $50,000 and months of work. And one of the biggest donors in the whole project, whose organization was donating half of the total cost, said he was done. He had enough. He was walking away from the table. And I thought, wow. I can't even express now how devastated I was in that moment. I remember I went to the chapel after our conference room. I went to the chapel at St. Luke's after our conference call. And I sat in the chapel. It was totally dark. It was just me alone. And I felt such a tightness. Have you ever felt that way? A tightness in my chest. It wasn't like a weight on me. Instead, it was something internal, like everything was just twisted together and I could barely breathe. And I didn't know what to do. I thought this whole thing's falling apart. And God, what are you doing? Why am I in charge of this? And I remember in that space having a peace. And it wasn't a burning bush. It wasn't an audible voice. But I distinctly felt God saying, Dave, if I called you to this, I'll carry you through it too. For I equip those whom I call. And God's point wasn't for me to carry it on my own. That's what I was doing. And that's why I felt this tremendous. God simply called me to play my part and to trust in him the rest of the way. And God did provide. He got that donor back to the table. And in time, the school was built. Here's what it looks like today. And it's this big, beautiful building with bright blue roof that is like a beacon throughout the whole valley. I'm so proud of that school. But I'm so thankful also for the lesson I learned in the process, because there's been many, many times my wife and I felt that same experience of stepping out on faith and feeling that tightness in our chest and learning again to trust in God. I feel it all the time leading this church as we've gone through COVID and all the other crises. There's been many times where I felt overwhelmed. And yet I remember that this is the part of the call, is to be in places where you are overwhelmed so that you fall back on God. The call is the crucible that drives us to our knees and that reminds us of our need for God. So what's your call? Where is God calling you? Do you have a sense of calling in your life, or are you running as far as you can in the opposite direction like Moses was? I wish the call was clear. I wish for all of us that we had burning bushes and audible voices and step-by-step instructions, but that's not the way it works, right? Oftentimes I think for myself, I'm much better at seeing where God has been leading me to this point than knowing where God is calling me from this point. Sometimes I only have enough light for the very next step, and yet God calls us step by step by step to put our faith in him and to trust in him. Paul Preiser defines vocation in this way. It's just the sense that we're living for something bigger than ourselves, that our lives and our stories participate in a grander purpose and a grander story about the world. Are you living out God's call? My father was a preacher, many of you know that, a Methodist pastor. And my mom's favorite sermon of his was on this particular passage, the story of the burning bush. And so she would quote it to us all the time, because my dad did one step better than Hemingway. Instead of doing 6 words, he told the story in 5. And his 5 words were, any old bush will do. In my father's reading, the bush wasn't just a sign of God's calling. It was a metaphor for Moses himself. That Moses was aimless, hopeless, fearful of whether he could do anything. And yet, the point was the power wasn't in the bush. The power was in the presence and activity of God. And even if Moses said, go to some other bush, God said, no, I can be active and present in your life just as surely as anything else. Any old bush will do. And so my dad closed his sermon with these words, and I'm going to do the same. Oh, my friends, this may be a time when you are wandering on the backside of your own desert, and off in the distance you perceive a light. There's something burning out there. Something has captured your attention. It may only be a spark, but it's not going away. And the reason it's not going away is because God is in it, and he wants to be in you. Will you come to investigate the light? Will you be a vessel that he can fill? Remember, any old bush can do, and it may be you that God is calling.
Hi, I'm Susan Arnold. Back in 2009, I started feeling very discontent in my job as a teacher. Just knew that God was prodding me into a different direction in my life, but I had no clue of if that direction was towards teaching in another school or something completely different. I had done mission work, and that was very much in my heart. So I put in my resignation. I started looking at other options. I looked into teaching at other schools and other districts, and I ultimately landed on wanting to work in the mission field. So I talked to many friends, family, church members, trying to get a sense of the direction, and people just kept saying how disaster ministry seemed to be my niche. I knew the next step was to get some training through UMCOR. That would open some more doors, but I had no clue of financially how that was going to work until someone from the church approached me and offered to send me to that training. So I went to the training in New York, was certified, and when I got home, the process began of trying to find where to go. In a week, I had gotten a phone call to go to Louisiana. I didn't feel ready at all, but I knew that if this was what God wanted, He would prepare me. I was not one who wanted to leave my family behind. All of my family is here in the area, and I would be the only one living out of state. God just kept opening doors. He gave me a sense of peace that only He can give, and I was able to raise the funding for the mission work in Slidell, Louisiana. I went down there to help rebuild after Hurricane Katrina. I didn't have a whole lot of rebuilding experience, but learned a lot on the job. I felt God working in so many different ways. The way that everything just came together in such a perfect manner. In my trip down to Louisiana, I am not one who enjoys going into places where I don't know anyone, and I had no fear. On my faith going forward, I have just clung to the idea that God is in control of every aspect of my life. He knows where He wants me to be, and I just have to keep my focus on God and pray and lift Him up and give everything over to Him. I'm Susan Arnold, and this is my story.